It's time to call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 32 of the House of Commons Special Committee on the Canada People's Republic of China relationship. Pursuant to the order of reference of May 16, 2022, the committee's meeting on its study of the Canada People's Republic of China relations with a focus on Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and the members. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and the members. Please wait till I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. And the clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. We appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. And I believe we have one substitution. In place of Mr. Cormier, we have Mr. Serret, who's joining us virtually tonight. Before we get to the witnesses in our first panel, I wanted to turn to the clerk and ask if there's been any correspondence of interest for today's session.
Yes, so in relation to the motion that was moved the other day and the request to have the Minister and Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, I got the note that the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance would be available to appear on Monday, February 26th from 8:30 to 9:30.
All right, good. Thank you for that update. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you, Kyle. Okay, so we have half of our first panel available to us. Mr. Nagy from the International Christian University Macdonald-Laurier Institute was to appear via video conference from Tokyo, but we have yet to connect with him. So we will instead turn to Meredith Lilly, Associate Professor, Simon Reisman Chair in International Economic Policy at Carleton University. Ms. Lilly, you have 5 minutes for opening comments, and then we'll go to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members, for the invitation. As the committee considers Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, I'll focus my comments on the links between economics and security, particularly with respect to Canada's international trade interests in the region. Engaging with the Indo-Pacific is vital for Canada as the fastest growing and most dynamic economic region in the world, home to 60% of the world's population and 40% of its economic output. But some course correction is necessary. Recognizing the increasingly dangerous and threatening international context, Canada must work with allies to link our economic interests in the Indo-Pacific with our foreign and defense policy objectives. Most importantly, we need to adjust our trade diversification outlook to reflect our core interests. Our diversification efforts in the Indo-Pacific are often framed as reducing our dependence on U.S. markets, but this is simply not supported by theory or evidence. The reality is that if Canadian firms trade internationally at all, they first trade with the United States. This, of course, makes perfect sense. The U.S. is Canada's only land neighbor, the world's largest economy, and a country that shares cultural, legal, and regulatory frameworks with Canada. It is only after Canadian firms are comfortable trading with the United States that a subset of those branch into additional markets. According to Global Affairs Canada's 2023 State of Trade Report, 46% of Canada's large firms export exclusively to the United States, half to the U.S. plus other countries, and only 4% export only outside the United States. So reframing our Indo-Pacific strategy to build on our foundations of trade with the U.S. can simplify and streamline our approach moving forward. Canada should pursue economic opportunities with countries in the region only if they're compatible with our trade interests with the United States. So this means we have to be much more strategic and deliberate about trade with China, while recognizing China is the major trade partner for all countries in the region. And to that end, I recommend the government focus in 4 areas. First, while the U.S. moves forward forcefully to de-risk supply chains, Canada has been entirely reactive. It is essential that Canada work more proactively to understand the threat environment and the potential impacts on our supply chains, and that it devote more resources to actively monitor and enforce Canadian laws around security and forced labor violations in imported products. Second, there are opportunities in the Indo-Pacific for Canada to lead others, particularly where the U.S. is absent. This year, Canada serves as chair for the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. A number of countries have applied to join, including Taiwan and China. In adjudicating these applications, I have recommended that CPTPP members apply a clear set of criteria, including the country's record of economic openness, trade liberalization, and reciprocity. A successful record must be established prior to entry to the CPTPP, a lesson China itself taught us when it joined the WTO in 2001 without reforming its economy. Third, Canada should not shy away from making tough foreign policy choices out of fear of losing access to China's market. China has been pursuing self-sufficiency for decades already. It will continue to import Canadian agricultural, meat, and natural resource products so long as it serves China's interests. But China also will not hesitate to close its markets to Canadian products for the same reasons as it did with Canadian canola in 2019. Australia is far more exposed to Chinese trade action in this respect, yet it continues to pursue its AUKUS security alliance and confronts China when warranted. Finally, Canada must be relevant to the Indo-Pacific, and on this, I think we are failing. Countries in the region are primarily interested in Canadian energy exports, especially LNG. The current Canadian government has sent them packing, ignoring the very real security challenges this poses for allies such as South Korea and Japan. Meanwhile, the United States became the world's largest exporter of LNG in 2023, helping to provide allies with alternatives to Russian energy exports. The U.S. may be our closest trading partner, but we are also energy competitors, and it is eating Canada's lunch. After mismanaging the oil and gas file, the government cannot repeat these failures on critical minerals. The federal government must work to restore foreign investor confidence in Canadian energy products and use its full legislative powers to work with provinces to prioritize and accelerate the regulatory permitting processes needed for success. Time is precious, and we need to match our efforts to the serious context in which we live. Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer questions from committee members.
Thank you, Ms. Lilly. Now, we are going to suspend for a moment. Our second witness, Mr. Nagy, is online, but we just simply have to do a sound check first, and so we will suspend until that's done. Right, we are back in session, and Mr. Nagy is online, available. I wonder if they found the snowplow in Tokyo. Maybe they borrowed Vancouver's snowplow. I don't know. But Stephen Nagy is the Senior Associate Professor, International Christian University, Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and he is coming to us from tomorrow in Tokyo. So, Mr. Nagy, you have 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chair. And yes, they do not have snowplows in Tokyo. They use water to blow away the snow. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share these points and speak on peace and security in terms of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. I'd like to frame my comments in terms of 3 particular areas. 1 is contradiction, 2 is IPS priorities, and 3, minilateral engagement. In terms of contradictions, I would like to just outline the many contradictions that I think the current government has been engaged in terms of how we are thinking about peace and security in Indo-Pacific and resources. Of course, in 2022, the Trudeau government released its long-awaited Indo-Pacific strategy, promising at least 2.3 billion Canadian dollars over 5 years to implement the strategy. That announcement came at the same time as our National Defence Minister, Anita Anand, promised Canada would spend $4.9 billion on modernizing our North American air defence. At the same time, our government committed funds to its objectives in Europe, including $2.6 billion to renew and expand Operation Reassurance, part of NATO's defense and deterrence measures in Eastern Europe. Of course, at the same time, we had an announcement about defense cutbacks, including defense. These contradictory positions raise inconvenient questions of how Canada is going to sustain its foreign and defense policy within the Indo-Pacific while resources are being diminished across the board or being deployed in Ukraine. How do we meet our priorities within the Indo-Pacific? Both foreign policy and defense policy really are being challenged. And I think that these contradictory positions are raising serious concern amongst our allies and partners about where Canada sits in the Indo-Pacific, what kind of resources are going to be deployed in the Indo-Pacific, and can we engage in a sustained, meaningful, and fruitful diplomacy. My second point has to do with Indo-Pacific priorities. And here again, I think that, quite frankly, we've spread the peanut butter way too thin in terms of how we are engaging in the Indo-Pacific. What should be Canada's defense priorities within foreign policy and defense policies within the region? And here, I particularly advocate for limiting or pulling back our Indo-Pacific engagement from the Western Indian Ocean and primarily focus on the South China Sea, the East China Sea, as well as the Pacific Ocean. And again, these are critical for Canada in that they have sea lines of communication that vary about $4.5 trillion of trade through the South China Sea and in and around Taiwan and the East China Sea. The major economies within the region, whether it's South Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, and the Southeast Asian countries, really are the bedrock or the most important players for Canada. And we need to make sure that the sea lines of communication remain secure, stable, and that Canada can engage freely within the region. Second, and I think important, is stable supply chains, in particular semiconductor supply chains, and this does revolve around the cross-strait relations. We need to find critical ways to foster peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits to ensure that those semiconductors can continue to be exported to Canada, that employ Canadians. North Korea also is a particular actor that I think we need to find ways to work with, and I'm going to come back into that as North Korea continues to produce weapons of mass destruction, both in terms of quantity and quality. A sixth area I'll focus on, of course, is China. And this is the Canada-China Committee, and we are, I think, on the same page of the book that China is interested in reshaping the region's security environment, security architecture, and how rules are being promoted within the region. We have a deep-seated interest in a rules-based order within the region. We have a deep-seated interest in pushing back against disinformation and other tactics to reshape the region that will be unfavorable to Canadian interests, including trade, including supporting our key partners like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and others. What are the key tools for engagement? Here I'm advocating for minilateral partnerships. This doesn't eschew multilateral partnerships, but much more focused, functional partnerships with 4 or 5 other like-minded countries to deal with specific issues that will enable Canada to add meaningful value within the region. A good example, of course, is plugging into the quadrilateral security dialogue. Plugging in means that we, on an ad hoc basis, plug into the quadrilateral security dialogue's maritime exercises, perhaps search and rescue exercises, humanitarian and disaster and assistance relief exercises to add value considering our limited resources. Another good example is plugging into the AUKUS agreement. I think the nuclear submarine part of the AUKUS agreement is distant from Canadian interests, but the AI and quantum computing components of the AUKUS agreement are clear areas where Canada can contribute, considering we've already secured budget for these cooperation in these areas.
Professor
We need to
Nagy,
advocate for new mini.
sorry, sir, you've gone over the 5 minutes. Do you care to just wrap up quickly here so we'll get to the
Yes,
questioning?
I'll finish up
Thank you.
on one point. New mini-laterals focusing on core areas that I think are of interest to Canada, and that is disinformation. Interesting combination could be working with Taiwan, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and the US to focus on disinformation, identification, and combating this within the region. And lastly, working in mini-lateral cooperation in the Pacific Islands on environmental issues and perhaps indigenous issues as well. Thank you.
And thank you. So we'll go to our first round of questioning, and we'll begin with 6 minutes or less for Mr. Kimmich.
Thank you, Chair. So, Professor Lilly, I wanted to go back to a comment you made that we need to be relevant to countries in the region, and then you described some of the failures in the Indo-Pacific strategy to be relevant. So I'm just going to quote here from the Canada West Foundation report, one of their briefing notes that they put out online. It says, repeated studies have found that an LNG export industry equivalent to 30 million tons per annum in British Columbia would inject about $7.4 billion into the Canadian economy over 30 years, along with supporting 65,000 jobs. And then goes on to explain that the export opportunities are mostly in Asia and LNG markets. When you talked about the failures, you said time is precious. Do you think we've missed the boat on an opportunity to export Canadian LNG into Asian markets?
I don't think, thank you for the question, sent some of our allies packing, telling them that there's none left for them. We're not going to build additional infrastructure beyond what is coming. And so, I'm excited about the successes that we have, but we have to do a lot more. And the messages that Canada is sending right now are very mixed, and lots of countries wonder why we aren't doing more to provide them with the LNG that they need, particularly in the current climate. And so we're seeing other partnerships go around Canada, essentially, to secure energy from partners that are willing to sell it to them, including the United States.
Are there any specific countries like Japan, beyond Japan, because Japan is the typical example that's given for an opportunity, or used to be an opportunity for Canadian LNG. Are there any other markets that we could reach as a country through the Indo-Pacific strategy that you see that could use our energy supply as a safe source of supply?
Well, in the past, I know that Korea has been interested, and I don't know whether they've moved on at this point to seek from others. But whenever these conversations come up, and I think, I'm fortunate being in Ottawa that I'm regularly invited to speak with foreign diplomats that are here, and the message that they constantly receive is that this isn't something Canada wants to explore, and so how many times they ask and are rebuffed before they move on to others that are happy to sell to them, I couldn't say.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Professor Nagy, then I have a question because you said mini-lateral deals. So why shouldn't we have a mini-lateral deal with, say, the government of Japan to export our LNG to them? Wouldn't that be an example of kind of using our comparative advantage, which is our West Coast access LNG export to a country like Japan? Couldn't we do a mini-lateral deal with the government of Japan to help them get the energy that they need?
So thank you very much for the question. So when I speak of mini-lateralism, I'm thinking about partnerships with 3 or 4 countries to deal with one potential functional issue. So I think that export to Japan on LNG would be a bilateral agreement. And here, when we're talking about bilateral agreement, the comparative advantages may be Japan's ability to build the technologies to export the LNG, and Canada would be the provider. So I think you're slightly mischaracterizing what I mean by mini-lateral, but I'm fully on the same page that I think that this is a partnership that has comparative advantages and shared interests, and that there's an opportunity for Japan to be a country that helps Canada open up its markets to energy resources, not only to Japan, but to key partners within the region.
So, Professor Nagy, then I'm going to go back to the Canada-Japan Action Plan, 2022. This was 6 areas were outlined in it between Ottawa and Tokyo, and they agreed to bolster cooperation. This is from your writing, so I'm just referencing it. Point number 5 talked about energy security. So wouldn't LNG exports and providing more of clean burning Canadian energy to a market like Japan help them meet their energy needs while also removing other sources of energy that are from conflict zones or their over-reliance on other countries that are not as secure a supplier the way Canadians are? Like, I thought this action plan that you've referenced in the past in your writing could form the basis of like maybe this mini-lateral deals with other countries as well, could it not?
Absolutely. So I think here we've lost an opportunity with some of our environmental policies back in Canada, where we have not been able to export to the countries that actually rely on safe, transparent, and stable energy resources. And that's something that Canada can be. Again, I think it can be an energy superpower, whether it's through this joint action plan with Japan or working with 3 or 4 other countries within the region to build those steady supply chains of energy, but also critical minerals to the region to ensure that their economies are stable and that they can continue to provide the goods that they do to Canada and Canadian citizens.
Very short, Chair. So for a country like Japan, how important it is to have a safe and stable supply of energy?
It's critical. They don't have indigenous energy resources. They export nearly 90 to 95% of their energy. And to work with a stable country like Canada that has huge energy resources would be a key asset. And I would advocate deepening that relationship and in using our energy and critical resources to benefit Canadians, but also to be that energy superpower that supplies the 3rd largest economy on the planet.
Thank you, Mr. Kimmich. We'll now go to Mr. Oliphant for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for sharing your expertise with us tonight. Professor Lilly, just want to give you a chance to help me with both not being afraid of China as a trading partner and also then your subsequent comment about really weaponizing trade as they have done in the past. You didn't use that word, but they have weaponized trade a number of times with Canada on a number of products, mostly Western Canadian products, but not completely. Help me with that one about opening, availability, recognizing the reality of China, also recognizing that we have a past that's problemed, and then all the other issues you mentioned, like labor and forced labor, et cetera.
Sure. Thank you, through the chair. Thank you for your question. Yeah, so what I meant by my comment where I said that China is the major trade partner, it's not just that Canada needs to think about its own trade interests with China, it's that every country in the Indo-Pacific, their major trading partner is China. So just as Canada is very dependent on our bilateral trading partner with the United States, all of those countries are very dependent on their trade relationship with China. And so, and that goes for something like the CPTPP, where, Canada and Mexico are very much a different animals in that arrangement because all other countries in the CPTPP have very strong trade ties with China first, the United States and or other markets second. So one of the things that means is that we need to be aware of the ways in which we're trading with those other countries. They are behaving the same way towards us that we behave when we think about trading with the United States. So we're both thinking about our respective elephant in the room. And we need to make sure that our own trade rules and trade behavior is cognizant of that. So that's one point. The second point is that, yes, we shouldn't be afraid to stand up to China, particularly in instances where it is Canada's national interest at play, and we know that China will weaponize trade against Canada. In my view, China will continue to import products from Canada when it wants to, when it is in China's interest to do so. There's some evidence that when it banned canola, Canadian canola, this was not just about the detention of the 2 Michaels, but there happened to be, during that same period of time, a record canola crop in China. And so it was quite convenient to reduce the amount of Canadian canola going to China at that time. And so I think that we just have to be extremely smart about it, and we must not at any time, in my view, sacrifice our goals as a country out of fear that China might turn around and reduce market access.
And quickly, you mentioned that we should have clear criteria with respect to CPTPP and the accession of new members. I think we have a reputation of being very clear, having added the progressive nature to that agreement, and just the hoops that UK went through to get into that world. What are you suggesting in addition to what we're doing now that would be helpful?
So Canada, as chair this year, is in a unique position to help steer that conversation. The accession of new members to CPTPP, though, is by consensus. And the reality is that while Canada and some others have serious concerns about the entry of China, there are other members that would like China to enter. I think that one of a good process to follow in attempting to depoliticize these issues and not make it solely about China, because if we make it about China, China will make it about Taiwan and so on. We instead follow a clear criteria on things like, to what extent does your country allow foreign investment in? How do you treat Canadian companies in your economy? And using that existing record of success or not to evaluate the applications and not to accept promises of behavior change in the future as criteria that would allow potentially a very large member to be accepted into TPP.
Thank you. I want to turn to Professor Nagy. You mentioned North Korea as being an area that a country we need to work with. You're the first person I have heard say that in several years. So I'm just wondering what you mean by working with North Korea.
I don't think I said that. I said that we need to work with other countries to deal with the challenge of North Korea. The reality, North Korea's weapons of mass destruction and proliferation are a challenge to
I think,
the region.
yeah, thank you for that clarification, because you did say it, actually, and we all noticed it, and eyebrows were all raised around the table. So thanks for I wanted you to clarify, because I didn't think that's what you meant.
No, not at all.
Okay, so this clarification is important. When you talk about the focusing of the IPS in certain regions and not in other regions, what criteria are you using to make those decisions? Like, what are you saying should be? Obviously, it's Canadian interests. Obviously, we have values, all those things which we all know. But you've been very specific about some targeting within the IPS, which I think is already quite targeted. What are the criteria that you have used to suggest South China Sea, et cetera?
We'll ask for a brief answer, Professor Nagy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think an abidance of rule of law is critical to which countries we choose to deepen our relationship, to converge strategic interests. And this creates more opportunities to work with countries that don't share the same political system, for example, Vietnam. And this is a challenge. How do we match these two contradictory positions? If we want to have a sustained position within the Indo-Pacific, and in particular in and around Southeast Asia, we're going to have some flexibility of how we deal with countries with different political systems. So in terms of criteria, countries like South Korea, Japan, Singapore are clear priorities, but we need to have some flexibility to ensure that we have partnerships with countries that don't share the same respect for democracy and human rights and rule of law, such as Vietnam. I think that this is the only way to have a sustained, meaningful presence in a heterogeneous region that has so many different political systems.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant. We'll now go to Monsieur Bergeron for 6 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to our two witnesses for being in attendance this evening. I think that your opening briefs and your responses to our answers will shed a lot of light on issues. Professor Lilly, now, right off the bat, and it will be useful for Mr. or Professor Nagy, who wasn't able to hear your initial testimony, but at the outset, you described a situation of Canada's economic reliance on the United States, which oftentimes demonstrates just how easy or not easy it is for Canadian businesses to do business with the United States. So we choose the path of ease most often. we often tend to put all our eggs in one basket, and that therefore when the United States adopts highly protectionist policies, that has a bearing on our economy, on our businesses, and as the old adage goes, when the United States sneezes, well, we feel the full brunt of it here back in Canada. So I don't know, but I'm asking the question of both of you. I don't know if you agree with me, but I get the sense with one of the unadmitted objectives of the Indo-Pacific strategy is to diversify our economy. And there have been many attempts in the past in that vein, under the Pierre Elliott Trudeau government, under the Jean Chrétien government, and thereafter under the Stephen Harper government. All of those endeavours, all of those efforts in the past were not successful, or at least not successful to the extent hoped for. So my question is directed at both witnesses, and in fact, Professor Lilly, you alluded to this when you referred to the need to deal with various countries under the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, to my question, how will the Indo-Pacific strategy, in your opinion, ensure our success where we've so often failed in the past?
Merci pour la question.
Well, thank you for the question.
So how will the Indo-Pacific strategy help us succeed? I'll be honest, I'm not sure that we will move from our current situation of it's upwards of 75% of Canadian exports now go to the United States. I'm not sure we'll see much of a change to that. I would agree with you that the Indo-Pacific strategy is framed as something that is supposed to help Canada diversify its trade. But the reality is that, as I said in my opening comments, only once a company is exporting to the United States will they also consider exporting anywhere else, the Indo-Pacific, Europe, anywhere else. It's, you know, the small minority are just exporting somewhere other than the United States. So as we diversify, we also will trade more with the United States as a result. That is just what our firms will do. And it's not that Canada is lazy in my view. This happens the world over. In all regions of the world, you are most likely to trade with your neighbors and with large economies. Our next door neighbor happens to be the world's largest economy. And so, you know, it fits theory and evidence that we do that. And so while I think it is important for us to trade with other economies because it can help in our relationship with the United States to demonstrate that we have relevance elsewhere, to demonstrate to the United States how we can be helpful to them, I will be honest, I think that thinking about trading with the Indo-Pacific as a way to move away from the United States is not the right tack, and I don't think it will be successful.
Monsieur Nagui.
Merci pour la question.
Professor Nagui.
Professor Lilly, with regards to the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy, I don't think it is an effort to diversify away from the United States. I think it is an effort to diversify away from an overdependence on the Chinese market. We've seen investments in Southeast Asia. We have Paul Topol, who's based in Indonesia right now. He is our trade representative there. We've opened up an office in Manila. We are likely to invest more resources in Singapore. So I think these are key elements to diversify away from China. That doesn't mean decouple, and I would like to be very clear about that. It means diversify away from the potential weaponization and monopolization of trade by China that could harm Canadian interests. In terms of the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy, I think that this is quite clear. How do we manage our relationship with the United States and our economic overdependence on the United States? I think that we should use the market to be more competitive, but also to understand how we can be diversify not only with the United States, but within the United States to create more economic opportunity for Canadians. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Peut-être.
Well, perhaps I could just make a segue into my second line of questioning. Now, in your article in August 2021, Why Does Canada Need an Indo-Pacific Strategy? as part of its foreign policy. Professor Nagy, you're in favour of a strategy that would optimise opportunities for Canada, tailored to the challenges of the region, and would create an independent Canadian trademark such that Canada wouldn't be perceived as a poor second cousin to the United States. Now, we're kind of caught up in the dilemma, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? How do we diversify our trade, and how do we do so without being perceived on the world stage as being in cahoots or poor second cousin to the US?
Mr. Bergeron, your 6 minutes have expired, but we'll park that question with Mr. Nagy, and next round he may be having the time to give you the answer you're looking for. But right now we'll go to Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both the witnesses for being here today and sharing your expertise with us. I am interested in your discussion or your comments on diversifying. And last week we heard from witness testimony that talked about that even when we diversify, even when we are working with other countries in the region, we are in fact still working with China because of those close relationships that they have. I'm looking at that context. I'm also looking at the United States, where we're talking about the idea of our overdependence on trade with the U.S. and a potential Trump presidency, which could be extremely difficult for our trade relationships going forward. And I'm just curious, what are those things that Canada needs to do to increase that diversification? And frankly, we've had this Indo-Pacific strategy for some time now. Has this led to any diversification from your perspective to this point? Dr. Lilly, maybe I'll start with you if I could.
Thank you. Through the chair. So has any diversification happened yet? It's difficult to say. And part of the challenge in assessing that is that the Indo-Pacific strategy was officially launched a year ago. Since the pandemic, while the Minister of Trade and others are very fond of saying that Canadian trade is higher than ever and we've been trading more than ever, the reality is that we know for a fact that Canada's increased trade since 2020 is the result of inflation, not increased volumes of trade. And so, for instance, this is in the Global Affairs Canada 2023 report from Global Affairs itself. And so what we know is that higher prices is what's fueling Canada's increased trade with the United States and others. So if you're looking at any figures, you have to recognize that even a $2 billion increase or a $20 billion increase, first you have to ask yourself, is this the result of prices or increased volumes of trade? Because we know volumes of trade are actually down and have not recovered. A couple of things that I think we can do, though, and that are important. First, just because we don't trade very much with the Indo-Pacific doesn't mean those exercises aren't important, particularly if it helps us build relationships for the long term for other reasons. So we're talking about wanting, for instance, to sign an FTA with CACN, but Global Affairs Canada's own assessments say that if we were to sign a deal, it would increase trade exports by Canada by $2.7 billion per year. It's frankly a rounding error when you think of the relationship with the United States. So, $2.7 billion, great, but it's still not a huge amount of trade. But if that helps us improve our relationships and help both sides who have our respective elephants in the room think about ways to cooperate with each other without always thinking about China or the United States, I think that's good. And so middle powers finding ways to be that fabric that keeps the global trading system together, where the two big powers aren't necessarily in the room or guiding the direction of that, I think can be a really positive contribution we can make.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Nagy, anything from your perspective?
I just add, I think that when we're talking about diversification of trade, I think we probably need to think about a sectoral approach to the diversification of trade. So Western Canada has different comparative advantages, energy and agricultural resources that were definitely needed throughout the region, where services and other products that can be delivered to Canada may be more suitable to Southeast Asia. So again, I think that we need a more nuanced approach to thinking about what we mean by diversification, but we also need a federal government that's going to unleash or release some of the untapped resources that exist within Canada. And right now, I think in terms of energy and critical security, our critical minerals, this is an area that many of the countries within the region are very interested in, but they find the current policies of the federal government frustrating because they're not able to get the kinds of resources that will create more economic security for the partners within the region. But we should be very clear, it's not serving Canadians either.
Thank you. Well, and I guess one of the next questions I have, and perhaps I'll start with you, Dr. Nagy, is with regards to risks to Canadian businesses. You know, we spoke about forced labor. There were some comments about that. So far, the only piece of legislation that has come out from the Canadian government is S211, which you know the NDP didn't support because we didn't think it was near sufficient. We have been told that other legislation would come forward, and it has not to date done that. What are the risks to Canadian companies? What are the risks that forced goods made with forced labor are getting into our supply chains, and what should Canada be doing to stop that?
So in general, I think issues such as forced labor are a moral issue, but I think the real risks to Canadian businesses really revolve around supply chains, sea lines of communication, and if there is a potential kinetic conflict within the region, how will this disrupt critical technology such as semiconductors being exported into the manufacturing sectors in Canada? Let me just give you an example. Of course, semiconductors is all the fashion, but in reality, those semiconductors go into the automobile factories that are producing cars in Canada and employing Canadians. So if we have a challenge across the Taiwan Straits or in the South China Sea that will disrupt these sea lines of communications, this will affect the automobile industries in Canada and the prospects for Canadian citizens. So I think that we need to look at this in a more complex way. Any businesses in Canada that use products from the region, whether it is critical minerals, lithium, semiconductors, or small parts, will all be affected by some kind of conflict within the region. And I don't mean to downplay the forced labor issue, because I think it's really, really important. But I unfortunately, I think it's a moral issue that I'm not sure that we can deal with. And we need to think about, again, the challenges associated with sea lines of communication and the weaponization of supply chains. But again, thank you very much for the thoughtful question.
And thank you, Ms. McPherson. That's your 6 minutes. We will now go to Mr. Chong for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask a question for Madam Lilly. You've advised a former Prime Minister on foreign affairs and international trade, and so I'd like to ask you a question about LNG exports. As you know, 15 years ago, the United States exported virtually no LNG. I looked it up. Last year, they exported about 4.5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, of LNG natural gas. It's not inconceivable that Canada could export 4.5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, which would, add, some almost 0.5% of GDP right there, if not more. And so, if you were working in a Prime Minister's office, what legislative, regulatory, and machinery of government changes need to be put into place to get us to a 4.5 trillion cubic feet of LNG exports? Maybe we can start with the machinery of government.
Thank you for the question. Some of this will be beyond my expertise. I can certainly speak to the trade side of things and some of the regulatory pieces. Certainly, everyone singing from the same song sheet is helpful in terms of across departments of government, across federal, provincial partnerships, including municipalities, including Indigenous populations, and ensuring that Indigenous populations can benefit. There's an imperative there, really, that everyone does have to be rowing in the same direction. I don't think that we have that today. I think as well, I wouldn't underestimate the importance of language from the top. It really does matter. And so when prime ministers are visited by foreign heads of state whose hand is out asking for LNG and they say, no, we've moved on, there's no business case for that, that's incredibly damaging, not just to that relationship, but to the rest of the world that is also watching. And I know your question is specific to LNG, but the other concern that I have about this is that that same experience and mentality that everyone who is watching has, they then take and they transfer to Canada's critical minerals approach right now. So they say, well, they can't build that pipeline. They had to sell it to the government. They can't. They've canceled several LNG projects. Now they say that they care about critical minerals because it's the right kind of energy, only we're pretty sure that they can't get all of these regulatory processes through. There doesn't appear to be any urgency or sense that we must move much, much, much faster. And so it's important for all of those things to be moving together in tandem. Those are a couple of the things I would say from a trade perspective.
I noticed in other countries that the government is much more directly involved when it comes to LNG imports and exports than we are. The German government directly ordered the construction of 6 new LNG facilities, some of which have already come online. Japan's government just, I think, about a month ago ordered, Mitsubishi to purchase, to sign long-term LNG import contracts. We've not traditionally had that close relationship between the government and our oil and gas sector that you see outside of North America. So I'm wondering how we can get government and industry working more closely together to meet what I believe is in Canada's strategic defense and security interests, which is to get more LNG to global markets, particularly for allies like Japan and Germany, to reduce reliance on authoritarian states for those critical energy supplies. And so I'm wondering what machinery of government changes are required, what regulatory and legislative changes are required in order for us to get the kind of speed to market that we see in places like Japan and Germany.
I think a lot of it actually does come down to political will. I have been very impressed at the speed with which the minister, the ISED minister, Champagne, has put political will behind the EV battery plants, and we've seen rapid movement around regulatory approvals, all departments of government, cooperation with the provinces, and that has happened very, very quickly at lightning speed by Canadian standards. So I think it's entirely possible, but I would agree that I don't think it has been prioritized that way in natural resources.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. We'll now go to Ms. Yip for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you both for coming tonight. Professor Lilly, you mentioned in your opening statement that unlike the U.S., who have taken steps to de-risk the supply chains, Canada has been reactive. What steps could Canada take to be more proactive in this area?
Thank you for the question. I think we could be doing a number of things. One is that we have to be looking for problems, and that takes resources and money. So Canada tends to adopt a reactive approach in that we rely on reporting in voluntary attestations of what's in shipments, and then we take people's word for it that what they say is in the box is in the box. And what we have to do is much more proactive investigation of imports. Certainly on the forced labor side of things, that is something that we have to do. There was a story last year, and I have not been able to investigate the veracity of it, but that in the Globe and Mail that the United States had 1,300 had intervened against 1,300 shipments to Canada's one on forced labor. It's just not possible that there isn't a more comparable, if we have a 10-to-1 ratio, we should have at least 130 cases in Canada. So if we're not looking, we're not going to see things. And we can't just rely on attestations and company reports when we're looking at these things. And there are a number of things. I should say Canada-US does have a supply chain investigation group, cooperative group. It has an interesting work plan. I have not yet seen the results of that, but we are looking at some integrated supply chain aspects, and I look forward to seeing the reporting out of that.
So you're suggesting we need more teeth?
We need more?
More teeth.
Absolutely. Yeah. If we care about these things, we should implement them well. And if we don't care about these things, we should stop talking about them, is my honest view.
Thank you. Professor Nagy, you suggested that Canada pursue mini-lateral partnerships to deal with particular issues, including disinformation. I believe you mentioned Taiwan and Australia as potential partners in this area. How might Canada work with these countries and other Indo-Pacific nations to counter disinformation?
Thank you very much, Ms. Yip, for your question. So first, I think we have to recognize Taiwan as what it is. It's a political entity according to our One China policy, and we need to be very clear about that. But they are on the forefront of disinformation from China. And as a result, they have the experience and they have the institutions to be able to, I think, be kind of the central nexus to help Canada deal with some of the disinformation challenges that we face within our own relationship between Canada and China. I also mentioned South Korea. South Korea faces disinformation challenges with regards to the North. And again, I think collectively using the different kinds of experiences that these countries on the forefront of disinformation have will be critical in terms of identifying disinformation, finding ways to combat disinformation and push back on disinformation. I include Australia because Australia's experience over the past several years with China has been very difficult. It also has experience in managing disinformation. And this is why I've advocated for, again, the collection of Taiwan, South Korea, perhaps Japan, Australia, and the United States to work with Canada to, again, share the patterns of disinformation that they've identified, the processes of which they push back. And I think importantly, how do we educate our citizens to, again, be more critical of the kind of information they read online so that, that we don't have to, or we can preempt the challenges that are associated with disinformation. So this is how I am envisioning a mini-lateral partnership between these countries and political entities.
Thank you.
We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Alors, Monsieur Nagy.
Professor Nagy, I don't know if you remember my question from a moment ago, but it's now time to respond to it.
Great. I honestly, I think a Canadian brand is very important, and the Canadian brand is going to include focusing on our comparative advantages. I think currently the Asia Pacific Foundation is doing quite an interesting job in turning about focusing on agricultural-related technologies and spearheading those initiatives in Southeast Asia. I think that other areas that we could focus is on education and, again, energy and critical minerals. These are comparative advantages that Canada has, and we need to develop a distinct brand that sees us as stable, sees us as having good services, and, again, a stable supplier of these within the region. I don't think that we have these are important because we can have a position that's distinct from the United States, but at the same time, this doesn't mean that we're in an antagonistic relationship with the United States. So again, education, agricultural, critical minerals, agriculture-related technology, and climate-related technology, I think are some key advantages that we can build a brand to engage within the region.
Et que diriez-vous de cette...
And what would you say to the claim that Canada has failed twice to get a UN Security Council seat on the basis that in developing countries it's increasingly perceived we're increasingly perceived as an extension of the United States on certain issues across the world, particularly the Israel-Palestine conflict?
I think Canada has an increasingly challenged relationship in terms of not having a principled approach to many issues. This is not so much related to the United States, but a track record over the past 10 years or 15 years. You mentioned the conflict in Gaza. This is an example what is our principled position on Gaza, and this does create challenges in terms of how countries developing countries see Canada as an independent thinker on issues, and we've really moved away from, I think, that position where we are an honest stakeholder or broker between Canada and other countries, or United States and other countries. We need to move back to that principled approach where we chart out a Canadian path and not a path that is necessarily always aligned with the United States. But maybe let's be clear, we are aligned with the United States on many issues because we share an economy, we have many shared cultural issues, we have respect for rule of law, and as a result, I think we will naturally be aligned with the United States on more issues than we're not.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Now to Ms. McPherson for 2.5 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Nagy, or Dr. Nagy, I'm going to start with you. You talked about the fact that forced labor was a moral issue, and I have to push back on that a little bit. And the reason for that is I do believe that it actually has economic impacts when we are seen by the rest of the world as not having, as you say, a principled position. You know, Dr. Lilly, you talked about the global fabric and that role that Canada has to play. If we abdicate our responsibilities with regards to forced labor, if we are not seen as having principled positions on a number of different fronts, if we apply human rights, if we apply, these principles inequitably in different situations, I think it's very problematic. You know, even the way that we're seeing China interact in sub-Saharan Africa and South America right now, and we are increasingly absent from those spaces, that is an economic danger to us, not just an ethical or moral issue, I guess. So I'd love. I'm actually going to pass it to Dr. Lilly first, just on her comment on that, and then if we have time, Dr. Nagy.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think it is obviously a moral issue, but also an economic issue, and some of that is because for all the reasons that we know, modern-day slavery and forced labor is awful. It also, for the countries that practice it, means that goods are cheaper in those places. And so when Canada is, for instance, in the world of critical minerals, much of the world's cobalt is harvested by enslaved children in Congo and other places in sub-Saharan Africa. All of that is awful, and we should fight it for all of the right reasons. It also reduces the global price of cobalt to a level below what the market should be paying, and that is bad for us, frankly. And so I don't like to put it in those self-interested terms, but it is all related. And so it's essential that we address those issues. It does make trade more expensive. It does make commodities more expensive, but that is part of the point.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. We now have time for 2 more slots, and we'll start with Mr. Chong for 5 minutes or less.
I think Mr. Seebeck
Mr. Seebeck?
wants around, yes.
There you go.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's so hard to decide what questions to raise. Dr. Lilly, CPTPP or pursuing one-off free trade deals in the Indo-Pacific, what would you say? Bring people into CPTPP or pursue one-off trade deals?
You'll have lots of time because it's straightforward for me. It's CPTPP.
Okay.
I think one-off trade deals are a bad idea. I think CPTPP is a it's a first-gen agreement, meaning that it's a top agreement, high standards, and so we should want to trade with economies that can play at that level, and if they can't, I don't know why we want to pursue free trade agreements with them.
Thank you. When you look at trade with China, how would you think the course forward is for Canada? I mean, I know we're not going to get a deal like the U.S. got on their Phase 1, but would pursuing some kind of a more, because we have so many trade irritants and the unilateral ability of China to impose all kinds of things on Canadian trade, what would you say would be the right course to try and pursue a better trade arrangement, for a lack of a better term, with China? Or is there?
I'm not sure we'll win that game. So I truly think that China will continue to import from Canada when it serves China's interest. And at the moment, we're under WTO MFN tariffs. They're already quite low in most things. So we could pursue some narrow sectoral trade arrangements. They're supposed to technically be illegal under the WTO, but this is the direction the United States has gone, and they've kind of said, just watch me, and it seems to be working for them. So if we wanted to pursue some narrow sectoral arrangements in agriculture or in meat and minerals and that kind of thing, we could, if they wanted to do so as well. But without that, status quo might be the best that we can do.
Switching back to forced labor, under CUSMA or USMCA, there are provisions that prohibit the importation of goods made with slave labor. United States has put together an entities list. They also have set the standard lower. If they suspect the business is engaged in their supply chain using forced labor, they have to prove they're not, and until they do, you can't come in. Canada won't copy the entities list. Canada has set the standard that CBSA has to prove that it's been used with forced labor. Should the government, for lack of a better term, smarten up and change the system to like the United States to ensure we don't have forced labor in our supply chains?
Thank you for the question. I think certainly if there's evidence in certain specific regions where we know that forced labor is ubiquitous, then yes, I would say that kind of adopting that negative list approach would be smart. It doesn't surprise me, and I think I'm familiar with the position of the Canadian government that they don't want to do that. I would agree with you that I think we need to grow up a little bit.
Are you familiar at all? I am getting in, as we say sometimes, getting into the weeds. Are you familiar with the U.S. entities list and how they've come about with that list?
I'm familiar with the list, but I don't know how they've developed it.
Do you think it would make sense for Canada? I mean, they're one of our closest allies. Wouldn't it make sense for us to be more aligned with the United States on this, to look at using their entities list? It seems like a very simple solution to a problem.
Using their list, or at least following a similar process, could make a lot of sense. During the USMCA negotiations, an area of real dispute between Canada and the U.S. was over the transshipment of Chinese steel. And the United States had concerns that steel bound for the United States was coming in through Canada.
Yes.
We can't afford to have Canadian exports to the United States cut off out of American concerns. For instance, there could be goods produced with forced labor being transited through Canada. So, I mean, on its own, we should not be allowing that to happen because it's bad, but separately, it's also bad for Canadian interests directly.
You're just about out of time.
Okay.
In fact, so close you are out
All
of
right.
time.
I am now.
All right.
Okay.
We will go to Mr. Frankistatos for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to both of you for being here tonight. Professor Lilly, you've said many very interesting things here tonight. I always like to give witnesses the chance to kind of summarize, if they like, your main argument for us, or what you would want us to really take away from your perspective as a committee in terms of a recommendation for the government that you think is of critical importance. I realize I'm probably forcing you to repeat yourself way back to your testimony, but a lot has been said since then, so I'd just like you to offer that opportunity to you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think if the committee could take away this reality that trade diversification goes through the United States, I think that would be a good thing. As much as we seem to understand it, we constantly try to forget that reality. And so when we're trying to diversify trade, we must do it in a way that works for that primordial trading relationship. And then I think also just being much more realistic, forward-leaning about supply chain resilience, the increasing marriage of national security with economic security. I mean, the Business Council of Canada came out with a report called that. If business is figuring this out, then we really should also be figuring it out. And so working to ensure that when we're operating in the Indo-Pacific and advancing our relationships with Indo-Pacific countries, that we do it in a manner that's consistent with all those things.
Okay. I know sometimes academics think and really even worry is the right word as to whether or not people read their articles. And I see that in 2017 you did publish a piece called How Demographic Transition Can Help Predict Canada Trade Relations in 25 Years. So a very interesting piece. So rest assured, people are reading your stuff for sure. Can I ask you about, and it's a very general question, but I wonder, do you think that demography and understanding Canada's demography has utility in this whole discussion about Canada-China relations?
Yes,
demography and
absolutely.
Okay.
I think that we often forget the importance of demography, aging populations. China has an aging population. There's lots of commentary that perhaps its economy has peaked. If you look at the aging demographic profile of China, that makes lots of sense. And if you look at markets where we should be spending more time thinking this one is rising, we should be thinking a lot more about Mexico, actually.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me turn to Mr. Nagy, if I could. Last week, Mr. Nagy, we heard from someone else from the Patterson School, and that is Professor Hampson, who told us not to worry about the BRICS at that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, obviously, and the alliance, if you can call it that, has grown a bit recently. He said not to worry about it right now, but Canada might have to worry about it in 5 years, and plan accordingly. That was his basic argument. What do you make of an argument like that? Thinking ahead, I think these are questions that we do have to keep in mind.
Thank you very much for the question. So I think the expansion of the BRICS committee is meant to create alternatives to the U.S. currency being one of the global reserve currencies and perhaps eventually internationalizing the renminbi. But in the reality, when we look at the heterogeneity of the BRICS and the expansion of the members, I really don't think it provides the kind of economic foundation that would be a viable alternative to the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency in 5 years or 10 years. Can it make the substantial changes in each of those countries to be more reliable, stable in terms of creating a viable alternative reserve currency to the United States? It's possible, but there's a lot of stars to align to make that happen. As Canada looks to the BRICS and it looks to its ability to I think, be a viable alternative to, I guess, a Western-led or a U.S.-led global financial system. I think that we should be more aware of how the BRICS represents really the global South or developing countries and how they may have a position in shaping some of the choices within international institutions such as the United Nations, et cetera. So I'm a little bit more, I guess, pessimistic about BRICS being a viable financial alternative to the current U.S.-led financial order. But at the same time, I do recognize that they have a bigger voice and they can shape the global South, and this can affect Canada's engagement internationally.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fragaskatos. That brings us to the end of our first panel. Professor Lilly, thank you for your time. Professor Nagy, boy, it must be a beastly hour of the morning where you are right now. You're looking surprisingly chipper for the hour of day that you're dealing with, so you can go throw yourself in front of a vat of coffee or something and get on with the rest of your day. But thank you both for being here. We will suspend while we set up for our next panel. call our session back to order. Want to welcome everybody back for our second panel. We have with us, actually we had somebody from Tokyo in the first panel, and now in the second panel we have somebody from Great Britain. So we are stretching the calendar around and the time zones quite a bit tonight. We have Cleo Pascal, Associate Researcher, Chatham House, Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, United Kingdom, by video conference. From the Basili School of International Affairs, Anne Fitzgerald, the Director, and as an individual, Deanna Horton, Distinguished Fellow, Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto, by video conference. I trust that the folks on Zoom have been given the information with respect to the translation, etc., if you need it, and the raise hand function and all of that, so you're all set to go? Excellent. Well, Ms. Pascal, we will begin with you for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you very much. And just to clarify, having had enough of British weather, I am now in Miami. Chair, vice chairs, members
well, you just
of the
lost
committee,
the sympathy vote. Okay. Good for you.
Thank you for inviting me to testify today and for your service to democracy. This is an excellent committee, very inspiring. I'm going to begin by explaining very broadly how I think the Chinese Communist Party looks at the world. Then, with that in mind, I'll offer some suggestions for how Canada might like to engage in one specific area. To understand CCP strategies, it helps to know two terms that are common in PRC think tanks. The first is comprehensive national power, abbreviated to CNP. China's Ministry of State Security-linked think tank describes CNP as the total of the powers or strengths of a country in economics, military affairs, science and technology, education, resources, and influence. It is a very broad definition. Adopted by Beijing in the 1990s, PRC researchers obsessively calculate every country's comprehensive national power score. Captain Moreland, who served as U.S. Coast Guard liaison to Beijing, explained that, quote, for the CCP, comprehensive national power as measured by a CNP score is a goal in itself, and pursuit of CNP justifies just about everything, end quote. Apart from the continued survival of the CCP, the main goal of the CCP is for China to be #1 in the world in terms of comprehensive national power. Given the rankings are relative, that can be achieved either through outcompeting others or by knocking others down, and so, comparatively, being in a better position. One way the PRC works to increase its own comprehensive national power while decreasing that of others is through unrestricted warfare. That's the second PRC term to remember. A 1999 book by the same name was written by two PLA, People's Liberation Army Air Force colonels. It details a no rules apply approach to targeting an enemy. This doesn't mean actual fighting is neglected, more that actual fighting is just one of a very wide range of weapons in the toolkit that the PRC employs, guided by perceptions of efficacy rather than morality or law. The colonel's book details 24 different warfares, including legal warfare, which we know is lawfare, media warfare, and drug warfare. As an example, drug warfare can mean either taking control of a medical supply chain and so increasing your comprehensive national power relative to a country that relies on you for pharmaceuticals, or pumping fentanyl into target countries and so weakening them and their comprehensive national power from the inside. The Chinese Communist Party uses unrestricted warfare to increase its relative comprehensive national power. It is the concept that connects the dots of everything from the artificial islands in the South China Sea to the BRI to getting Canadian teenagers addicted to TikTok. What does this mean for Canadian global engagement? First, an acknowledgement that any good plan, something that bolsters a country's resilience and sovereignty, will be seen by Beijing as a loss to the PRC's comprehensive national power score and so is likely to be attacked. That means anything you try to build should include a plan to protect it, to block malign influence. We need a block and build approach. As for Canadian engagement, let's just look at one geographic area, Oceania, including the Pacific Islands. This is the contested strategic front line between Asia and the Americas. If China gains control, it can box in Taiwan and Japan, South Korea and Australia, and push America back to Hawaii, as Imperial Japan tried to do through its control of its islands during World War II. Conversely, if democracies flourish, it means the survival of a free and open Indo-Pacific. The stakes couldn't be higher. In this context, there are broadly three ways for Canada to engage internationally. First, by bolting on to existing multilateral fora, such as the Pacific Island Forum. Second, by joining a new consortium early enough to shape its development from the start, for example, as would have happened if we had joined Quad or AUKUS. Third, bilaterally and people to people, ideally through specifically Canadian strengths. While all three are important, it might be helpful to spend more time on what's often last on the list, the bilaterals. It would show partners that Canada isn't just a weaker version of Australia, but has something special to offer. For example, there are cultural and historical linkages between the Polynesians and some First Nations, including specifically the Haida. First Nations and Inuit leaders know and understand the challenges of tight-knit communities living in relatively isolated locations, in many cases with complex communal land laws. A knowledge exchange program between them and the people of Oceania would be groundbreaking and trust and resilience building, something few, including the CCP, could offer. Another potential advantage for Canada is language. Some of the Pacific Islands speak English, some French. There's limited crossover between English and French analyses. Canada, in particular Quebec, could set up a global center for excellence for bilingual Oceania analysis that can host visiting scholars from the region, as well as the US, Japan, India, and elsewhere. As an additional bonus, French citizens can study for graduate degrees in Quebec at the same rates Quebecers pay. Students from French Polynesia and New Caledonia are already studying in Quebec. Quebec's proximity to Washington and the United Nations in New York is also a benefit. This is the sort of approach that can explain to the world why Canada. The CCP will not stop in its attempts to increase its comprehensive national power, including by using unrestricted warfare. To ensure democracy continues to flourish in the Indo-Pacific and beyond, we need to block and build, ideally using the tools that are uniquely and wonderfully Canadian. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank the excellent translators. Merci.
Thank you, Ms. Pascal. We'll now go to Ms. Horton for 5 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this evening. I would like to focus my remarks on three major themes. First, while the announcement of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy was welcomed by many stakeholders, Canada should make every effort to ensure its implementation and even go further in order to reverse its flagging reputation as a reliable partner. Second, the increasing activity of Asian states, including China, in the Arctic means that de facto, the Arctic is part of the Indo-Pacific, and Canada should be upping its game in support of Arctic development and security. Third, Canada should be leveraging its relationship with key U.S. allies in the North Pacific, namely Japan and Korea, and work with them not only in the Arctic, but also in Southeast Asia, where they are major investors and take advantage of their long-standing experience in dealing with China. One, Canada has a long history of coming and going in Asia. The Indo-Pacific strategy could indeed be a generational change, but its budget is not large, and it may be a challenge to keep the funds flowing in an era of budget cuts. But Canada should stay the course and leverage other relationships for greater impact. In this context, I would like to make the point that Canada does very little to leverage one of its most important assets in Asia, namely our large Asian diaspora and alumni from Canadian universities. These pools of human capital would no doubt prove invaluable if we were to call upon them to get involved and to share their knowledge of Indo-Pacific markets, business norms, culture, and local politics. Our representatives abroad are likely already in contact with some of these talented people, but this should be actively encouraged and supported by the Government of Canada. Two, many Canadians would be surprised to know the extent to which Asian nations are implicated in the Arctic. China has declared itself to be a near-Arctic state, with the development of the so-called Polar Silk Road as a priority. Japan has a long history of Arctic engagement, in particular regarding scientific activities, polar research, and innovation. With climate change and the prospect of greater use of the Northwest Passage, South Korea will also focus on shipbuilding. All are interested in mineral development, including critical minerals. As Monk School founding director Janice Stein stated in a conference last year, the Arctic will be the next bucket investment, big bucket investment for Canada. Yet the necessary investments in Arctic infrastructure and security, in spite of the fact that this region is central to Canadian interests, are yet to happen in any significant way. I would argue that further investments in technologies such as spatial and drone reconnaissance and combining with NATO and other partners to shore up defenses and build the Arctic's economic resilience would be a long-term benefit to Canada. 3, Indo-Pacific strategies arguably came about as a means of countering China's growing influence in Asia. Canada joined the fray after many of the other players. I believe that in order for Canada to achieve the maximum impact on a sustainable basis, we should be allying with other democratic nations, in particular, U.S. allies such as Japan and South Korea. The trilateral summit, USA, Japan, South Korea, that took place in August 2023 was truly groundbreaking, and there is little doubt that part of the incentive for the increased level of collaboration was the push not only for enhanced communication and interoperability, but also for greater burden sharing. The USA is facing challenges on all fronts and would no doubt appreciate Canada's taking on its fair share in the Arctic, which could free up vital resources for other Indo-Pacific ventures. In addition, Canada should be taking advantage of Japan and Korea's technical, innovation, and business expertise to expand opportunities in the Arctic and Indo-Pacific, especially in Southeast Asia. Canada has a good deal of experience in dealing with the United States, Japan, and Korea with China. Against the backdrop of potential changes in America's leadership in Asia, Canada would be wise to strengthen these North Pacific relationships. Thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions.
And thank you, Ms. Horton. We'll now go to Director Fitzgerald for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and honourable members of the committee. The world's changed profoundly. The multilateralism model, based on the rules-based order that Canada has subscribed to over the years, has been undermined by geopolitical rivalry and a winner-takes-all set of rules. This leaves one question. What is the new playbook for middle economies? Something which, in my view, and because it cannot be the same multilateralist model, remains indeterminate and undefined. There's a new Cold War II which concerns enmeshment rather than decoupling witnessed in Cold War I. We are in a world where power is based on who owns and controls data and intellectual property, where people fight over IP and data in an arena defined by an intangibles versus tangibles marketplace, and in a world where democracy becomes eroded due to private gain. We therefore need a playbook and a policy orientation to suit this reality, particularly in the context of a Canada-China relationship moving forward. In the time I've been allocated, I'd like to emphasize that this position requires both de-risking in areas where we can engage and decoupling in areas where, due to rules, values, and standards, we must limit our engagement. The need to continue trading with China and engaging with China around international tables means that our ability to de-risk depends entirely on our ability to understand what the risks are. So when we think about China, we should think, in my view, about intellectual property, data, AI, demographics, and maritime and land-based corridors. Despite the demographics facing the country's current economic and political models, it's raced ahead with technology-related IP and its own data governance standards in order to reap longer-term benefits from others. Canada must compete in this very complex terrain by adding value to the global supply chain with its own IP-protected technology advancements. This will enable Canada to engage and negotiate with China with strength and remain a serious economic player in this changed global context. Global powers have acknowledged the risks associated with narrow maritime corridors like the Straits of Hormuz and the Red Sea. Alternative corridors are now being developed. The U.S. seeks to win Saudi Arabia's support in a new land-sea corridor partnership running from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, while China pushes billions into a new middle corridor trade route linking it to Europe. Cross-continental corridor competition is also being pursued on the African continent. As these new routes develop and based on the challenges that China will inevitably face in negotiating its middle corridor with Europe, China will also be monitoring how climate trends will make parts of the Arctic inhabitable over the next 25 years, and with its Arctic vessel and ice-breaking capability, will be planning accordingly. China will therefore come to Canada with its own ideas of ocean governance in the Arctic and negotiate around these ideas. At the same time, China will maintain its capability to massively disrupt North America through data, AI, IP, cyber, even by way of TikTok algorithms. The fact that we must work with China, buy things from China, cooperate on agenda like the climate with China, makes for challenging and complex geopolitical terrain. This is even more acute for middle economies like Canada, which are more vulnerable in the face of the geopolitical tactics of others. Sun Tzu said that when in doubt, go to higher ground. Maya Angelou said, when we know better, we do better. In terms of Canada's relationship with China, my view is that all roads lead to a priority consideration, which is national capacity building. This requires us to be honest about our civil service capacity to operate in an intangibles marketplace and question whether or not we have the institutions required to defend our interests in this intangibles world. This priority is, I feel, also a precondition for the execution of the government's Indo-Pacific strategy. We need intellectual bilingualism across the national civil service and the security sector so that data science, big data, algorithms, AI, ICT, large language models, sensors, and devices, all of which I would refer to as the core enablers of emerging transformative technologies, is standard parlance and knowledge across government, and which enables Canada to strongly advocate for international civil service capacity in this multidisciplinary domain. In my engagements in Europe, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East over the last 18 months, it's evident that we have some work to do and catch up on the global realities. We must also have a solid ocean governance framework firmly in place in order to be in a strong negotiating position when China starts building infrastructure and maritime corridors through the Arctic. Lastly, we must do everything we can to maximize the strength of our higher education system, which in my view remains one of the strongest national instruments of power here in Canada, and to protect this central mechanism for thought leadership and intellectual property by having effective, relevant, and centrally agreed strategies, such as a strong research security framework. In conclusion, I recognize that this is complex terrain and a wicked problem. As a research professor of international security, I myself have had to learn, adapt my knowledge, research, and teaching pedagogy to these realities. Perhaps I could just leave off by saying that we must all learn, develop mechanisms for this knowledge and capacity building, and seek to become better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to our questions, and we'll begin with Mr. Chong for 6 minutes or less.
Yeah, I wanted to, since supply chains came up, I don't know if any of our witnesses have expertise in this or knowledge of this, but I'm wondering if any of our witnesses know about Log Inc., which is the People's Republic of China's data logistics port management system, which is now being used worldwide, and where 50% of cargo container equivalents are being now shipped via this logistics system, which the PRC controls. So I don't know if any of our witnesses are familiar with the system. If not, I'll move on to other questions. So, okay,
Sorry, I have familiarity in terms of its imposition in Africa and propping up its strategy in Africa, which is driven by infrastructural development and a very predatory financial model. Which
maybe you could speak a bit to it then. You know, as I understand it, this system was created some 2 decades ago. It was initially an initiative of the Ministry of Transportation of the People's Republic of China. It was initially only available to PRC ports, had users in those ports, and since has spread globally. Apparently there's 500,000 users of the system. 24 ports outside of the PRC are linked into it now, and 50% of global container traffic now travels via the data logistics of that system. And so some have suggested that this is a huge issue. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on this, how much of a risk that system is, and whether or not there needs to be an alternative to that system, seeing how the pandemic supply chain disruptions demonstrated how vulnerable we are if we rely on a single point of failure like that.
Well, I think it's akin to a bolstered threat vector, I would say, because it has made a logistical system functionable for national interests in a data-driven and digitalized world. So it's laying down standards for the governance of the AI, the data, and the algorithms that are making that network function, and it's spreading. So, I mean, that's an issue because these threats and new threat vectors are difficult to surround because they're spreading through data and digital means. So, I think the committee is well aware of the strategy of the BRI in Africa. It's a long commitment that involves receipts for technology and IP and the infrastructure that's laid down. And that relationship is further entrenched by the data-driven, digitalized capability within this. So, I see this as bolstering the threat vector and not reducing it, and making the predatory financial nature of the logistical arrangement.
I think the chair has indicated some other witnesses would like to jump in on this. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I would just like to add, I've seen a demonstration from Maersk. They have obviously a system of their own, but I entirely agree that one of our biggest challenges is countering China's activity in the digital sphere. I have written about this, and I think that one thing Canada should be doing, we can't do it alone. We should be aligning with other partners. And I think we should also be ensuring that digital technologies are also transmitted as part of development assistance. Because right now, often it's only the Chinese that are offering this. We have a lot of expertise that we can share, and I think this should be really a part of what we are doing, not only in Asia, but in other parts of the global south. Thank you.
Ms. Pascal?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, so this is very consistent with the comprehensive national power approach, where you try to get into everywhere you can on the systems. The thing that we've been tracking more is the cranes, the ship-to-shore cranes. China has a company, ZPMC, that has about 80% of the ship-to-shore crane market in ports around the world. And it's now been declassified that these things can spy. They have sensors, so they can spy on military-related cargo. They can potentially be remotely controlled. So we know that sort of deep within the seemingly mechanical systems of the ports, you have potential Chinese control. And this is symptomatic of the way that Chinese companies have embedded themselves across critical infrastructure, including obviously water, electricity, traffic, and everything else. So that's definitely, it's part of the problem, the logistics that you're talking about. But even if you just look at the physical infrastructure that is on the ports, there's the potential for remote control and for using them as intelligence gathering platforms.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Frankiscatos for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all of you for being here. Professor Fitzgerald, I'll start with you. You used the term enmeshed in your opening testimony with respect to China. Can you just go over again how you're using that? What you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm using it in terms of interactions, not complete divorce and decoupling, but interactions, social, economic, political, and military interactions.
Okay.
So that is why I suggested that a dual-track strategy needs to be taken forward, characterized by de-risking and decoupling. But in order to be able to manage that approach, knowledge of the risks that we need to de-risk is necessary.
And so what are those risks fundamentally to you?
I believe that the risks involve looking at core enablers of emerging transformative technology to see how they are applied to existing technology to enhance them further. There's a dual usage nature of the resulting technologies. The rosy side of that transformation needs to be embraced, but the dark side needs to be guarded against. And it's my view that we are lacking governance, accountability, legal and ethical frameworks to manage the technology that becomes created, and not having the responses to answer the question, should we make it, instead of can we make it?
Well, give me an example of a technology that you're particularly concerned about, and how Canada, I'm guessing you're going to argue, and forgive me if I'm being presumptuous, but I think you'll argue Canada can't do this on its own. It'll have to do it in concert with others.
Yeah.
But what technology would you focus on as a particular concern?
The way in which data, devices, sensors, AI, large language models come together in different ways and different combinations to produce new inventions and new innovations. The knowledge to write policy and legislation guiding those developments is critical, and that is why I'm focusing on national capacity building that promotes intellectual bilingualism.
Very interesting.
You even have end products which should be embraced. They're very, very, very good for climate, very good for education, higher education, very good for zero carbon, zero hunger. So it's those global goals that unite us all, the STEM community and the social science and humanities, but without the proper governance filters that the transition takes them through. Some undermine the global goals, some miss entirely, some have a direct path to them.
Do you think that the Indo-Pacific strategy offers a general framework for Canada to join with other partners and meet this challenge that you're talking about in terms of offering a response?
I think that Canada has to have something quite powerful to bring to the table, and it's better to sometimes drill down and say, let's focus on these three things because we can offer weight in these areas instead of spreading too thinly. And I would like to focus in this regard on the armed forces. I think Canada, this is not the first time that Canada has had to confront a time when it can't develop conventional strength in all areas of the military. It has to drill down and focus on niche areas to have something to bring to its like-minded partners and to not be left out of any seat at any table. And I think one thing that we do very well in this country is higher education. We've had founders of Google, Meta, other companies publicly thank Canada for providing them with their leadership cadre. So I think that if we built a military capability based on our great cyber strength and AI strength and our ability to perform in a data and digital-driven world, then we would be bringing something to the table, because that remains a foreign and security priority of all our like-minded allies. Equally, the higher education system could bring a lot in terms of science diplomacy, and we could help influence standards to operate in this data and digital-driven world.
Thank you very much. Professor Horton, I've limited time, about a minute and a half, maybe less, but I was quite interested in the point that you raised about diasporas. And could you expand a little bit about that with respect to the Indo-Pacific strategy and what Canada could do to encourage participation of diasporas towards the fulfillment of that strategy writ large?
In my response, I was referring in particular to Canadians who are already in Asia. We have a lot of Canadians throughout in all the major markets, and my personal experience, and that has been confirmed by others, is that we don't, unlike some of our other, I wouldn't say competitors, but other countries with large diasporas, we don't do nearly enough to take advantage of those people who are already on the ground. And this would be, I think, and important for going ahead. If we want to encourage further investment, we need more knowledge. And the more that we can use the knowledge that's already there, the better, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fragascatos. We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes or less.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses for being here with us this evening. And in the case of Ms. Pascal, I think it's quite late where you are. But Ms. Fitzgerald, in an article that you wrote in collaboration with Mr. Jonathan McShire-McMillan, which was published in ePolitics, you said that Canada continues to be uncertain about properly defining its interests and hasn't done anything recently to define a national security or defence or foreign policy strategy that would be clear. Moreover, you said that you get the sense that the government of Canada tends to put the cart before the horse, and by working on a defence policy without having first defined its foreign policy and coming up with an Indo-Pacific policy without having defined a general foreign policy. What do you think about that?
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, I do believe that the cart is before the horse in many cases. Policy strategy, let's call it, there are different things that, that are relevant to different countries and different strategic cultures. But in order to prioritize and not have aspirational as opposed to achievable frameworks and strategies and concept papers, we need to lay down what it is at the root of all these strategies. So that's why we argued in that article for the articulation and codification of national interests. Because, for instance, a defense policy is all about protecting, preserving, promoting, and defending those interests. And the codification and articulation of a national interest can also strengthen the social fabric of a country, which for a diverse country like Canada is terribly important. And, to go into any corner of the country and have communities be able to stand up and say, the heart of Canadian society is A, B, C, D, and E. That's tremendously powerful, and I've seen this by facilitating the national security strategies of many other countries. I think that a foreign policy framework is, or a national security framework is something that other instruments of government's frameworks are subordinate to. And national security, as the previous panel pointed out, is hip to hip these days with economic security. So national security is almost everything. It's the biggest macro strategic tool of government. But at the heart of it, and something that does not and should not move with different political administrations, something that's the anchor of the ship in rocky waters, is national interests. And having a dialogue around that, laying those down, allowing those to be the root of the subsequent strategies is important. So at the moment, I suppose I feel that Indo-Pacific strategy, feminist international foreign assistance program, et cetera, are jumping a bit further down. They're very important cogs of the system, but they're cogs. And there should be a system which articulates priorities and is very clear about what Canada's not going to do at the moment as well.
Merci beaucoup. Peut-être une question à Madame.
Thank you very much. A question for Ms. Pascal. Now, I was expecting to hear you say a few words in French in your opening remarks, but I'm sure that we'll hear you in French in a moment or so. But as you're probably aware, members of this committee went to Washington a couple of weeks back to dialogue with our American counterparts. And I think that we reached the conclusion that we need to pursue a dialogue and that our US allies would come to Ottawa at some point. Now, I think that there needs to be some dovetailing of our Indo-Pacific policy and strategies, but there's also a need to be different in certain areas. Now, in terms of common ground and discrepancies, are our strategies complementary or are they opposing in some ways? Well, I'm sorry, I haven't spoken French for a long time, so I'm lacking somewhat in terms of the terminology, and I apologize in advance. But I should point out that I'm also in Miami right now, so I'm no longer in London, given the storm that is happening over there. But it's a great question, and there's a lot of synchronicity, obviously. But Canada and Quebec can do a lot. Quebec is represented across the Indo-Pacific, and Quebec can do very different things that would be beneficial in terms of bolstering security in those regional areas. And I think that that would be helpful to all parties at the end of the day. Now, in the last round, you asked a question of a witness about the United Nations Security Council seat. And that's a perfect example of the problem that we're coming to grips with. We worked with the Australians and the New Zealanders in order to get the Pacific Islanders' votes. The Pacific Islanders don't want to take orders from Canberra or Wellington. They want us to go in person, speak to them in a friendly, approachable manner, tell them what is important to us, understand what's important to them in terms of a common future. So it's crucial that we're there in person as Quebecers, as Canadians, on the ground, in order to really, truly have a handle on what they're facing and addressing, that we're not the United States, we're not France, and set ourselves apart in that manner. So therefore, there's no way to kind of take shortcuts in that regard. You just have to go to those countries, speak to them, and understand what their challenges are.
Minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses. This has been very interesting. Ms. Pascal, I just want to quickly follow up on my colleague, Mr. Bergeron's comments. From what I could take from your testimony, it would be very useful. I mean, you talked about bilaterals and how important that was. The role of parliamentarians being able to visit the region and engage in parliamentary diplomacy, I would assume, would be very helpful and something that I know that this committee is going to be talking about after. So thank you for raising that with us. One of the other things I wanted to ask all three of you, actually, is the idea of post-secondary institutions and the role that they play. I think all of you have mentioned that in some way, and I actually met with the presidents of the 15 top universities in Canada earlier today, and they expressed some real concern about the Indo-Pacific strategy and the implications for them. So, of course, we have the idea where we need to block and build. Ms. Pascal brought that forward. The idea of decoupling versus de-risking, but also the idea that we want to build those relationships when they are useful, when they help us build our national capacity. We want to have those relationships in terms of working with university alumni, in terms of recruitment for our post-secondary, in terms of research. I'm wondering how we manage that relationship. How do we ensure that our post-secondary institutions are able to do the work that we need them to do, but also not putting Canadian public interest or Canadian interest at risk? Maybe I would start with you, Ms. Fitzgerald.
Thank you very much. It's a great question. And lest I be a bit provocative here, because I understand fully well why higher education is led at the provincial level in a federal system, but I feel that it's a very powerful tool, national instrument of power, and needs some grand strategic direction. And for instance, I'll give you an example. It's amazing, I find, that every university is trying to grapple with AI standards and rules at the moment. It's a waste of productive time for all universities to be doing this individually. A research security strategy. Again, I mean, these are central issues that require a powerful framework and don't need to be differentiated at the provincial level like other things do. So I do feel that we can project our higher education capacity. It's a time, in my view, with post-Brexit Britain and probable return of Trumpian politics to the South, where Canada should be attracting the best in the world. But in order to have those frameworks that can operate in a higher education environment, which is in a digital and data-driven world, which requires, alignment with immigration systems, et cetera, there needs to be discussions regularly at the central level. Thank you.
Ms. Pascal, did you have anything you'd like?
I was going to draw your attention to some hands up on the screen.
Yeah, thank you. Quickly. So, yes, it would be definitely very helpful. And there are, for example, in the Pacific Islands context, the U.S. does most of this engagement through the East-West Center, which is funded by the State Department, based out of Hawaii and D.C. In the context of the East-West Center, Canada is not considered part of the Indo-Pacific. So just by figuring out how to join some of these organizations that have already trod those pathways to figure out how to do it and who already have these networks in place might be able to speed along our engagement. But a big problem is going to be the visas. We need to figure out better ways of facilitating visas. If you're sitting in Palau, for example, the visa to get to Canada is issued by Canberra, by Canada's office, which is, kind of an 8-hour flight away and extremely expensive. So a lot of these kind of technical issues need to be cleared out of the way. And in terms of the parliamentary visits, that would be incredibly helpful because democracy is really under attack. If you look at a place like the Solomon Islands, where they've already delayed elections, just having parliamentarians come and let the proto-authoritarians know we're keeping an eye on you, and reassuring those that are fighting for democracy in their own countries that they do have allies beyond their shores would be incredibly helpful.
Thank you. And Ms. Horton, do I have time for Ms. Horton to, please?
Thank you very much. I would agree with everything that's been said, but I would also like to add that I noticed that when you're looking at trade missions, you often have universities and community colleges on those missions. And I think there are a lot of universities with strength in the Indo-Pacific. And I think with the digital tools, last week I taught a class at U of T where the students were in India. So I think that with the digital tools available and with more government support, I recognize that it is a provincial issue, but I think there's a lot of room for more involvement and also for more Canadians support for Canadians studying in Asia. We have so many Asians studying in Canada and very few going to Asia. And so I think what should happen is the students, rather than going for their junior year abroad in Europe, they should be going somewhere in Asia. That's where the future is.
That's just about your time. Thank you, Ms. McPherson. We'll now go to second round. Mr. Seaback for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're talking a lot about security here, so I want to quickly just look at one of the sections, Indo-Pacific, which is make meaningful contributions to the region's security and enhance our defense and security relationships, bolster longstanding collaboration with the contributions to Five Eyes. It seems to me there's some notable glaring things that are not included in this. The two that pop out at me are what's been mentioned before, both AUKUS and the Quad. I would love to hear from all the witnesses today because to me it seems like a very large strategic mistake that Canada wasn't in on the ground early in both of these things and what we can do to try and fix that.
Thank you very much. I'll have a first go. I think encouraging publication of the defense review that is, I understand, is supposed to be happening at the moment. Seeing some priorities. I think we need to be more predictable to our allies. We can't be spread thin across the conventional capability that has limited utility these days. Even the conventional capability that we're seeing in the Middle East, in Africa, in other parts of the world is based on an insurgency model. And it's the same insurgency model as Doha, Malaya campaigns in the past, but it's taking to the waves. It's taking to digital insurgency. So the capability needs to change. We have a great deal to bring to that capability in terms of defense diplomacy. If you remember when we did have that capability in the early 2000s, late 1990s, we made an enormous impact in the world in defense diplomacy. And it's an inexpensive way to make a great impact that could feature heavily in our strategy. And if it was geared around AI and cyber, et cetera, it would be zapped up by our AUKUS allies.
The other two, either one who wants to go ahead.
I went first last time, so Dr. Horton.
Yes, Dr. Horton, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add that the second pillar of AUKUS is something that should be of interest to Canada, and I'm hoping that that will be followed up. I would also like to add, though, that we have a lot of capacity in things like training and the soft aspect, as mentioned earlier, defense diplomacy in a way, and that does not require the hardware that seems to be difficult for Canada. And I think that even things like that we can work on with other partners. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to work with other like-minded partners in Asia. There's not a lot we can do alone. We all have to work together.
Thank you. If I may, it would have been great if we had joined Quad and AUKUS. That would have made us a very different profile in the region. I'd also just like to bring up something that hasn't been brought up, which does seriously affect our security profile in the region, which is Canada's relationship with India. So India, had a very successful G20 meeting. It has very deep and growing relationships with Japan. We obviously have our problems with India, but the loud problems with India, it is Indo-Pacific. At least a big chunk of it is India's turf, not Canada's turf. And if India doesn't think if we have problems with India, then it becomes a problem for Canada. But the other thing that I'd also say is that in terms of security, right now, as mentioned in the opening, a lot of the problems are on the political warfare level and have to do with corruption. And in many of these countries, they need lawyers more than they need warships. They need people to go after the Chinese organized crime, to go through the financial records and help figuring out who's getting paid off. That sort of thing we can do quite easily. We can send over experts from various other Canadian government agencies or ministries to help them clean up their systems. Because unless we do that, unless we can get rid of the corruption or at least minimize that Chinese corruption, that's the blocking. We won't be able to build anything else effective.
Just about out of time. Thank you, Mr. Seaback. We'll go to Madame Lalonde for 5 minutes.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much to our witnesses, and certainly appreciate it. The perspective that's been brought forward this evening. Maybe I would like to hear a little bit more about, there was a comments made by, I'm not sure exactly if it was Mrs. Orton or Mrs. Pascal, and maybe any of you could help, but the IPS specifically indicates Canada's intention to engage with strengthening our strategic partnership with ASEAN. What is the larger role of the ASEAN within the region, and how does that, or we could improve that relationship?
I'm happy to take it, but Professor Horton, if you want to. Yeah.
Go ahead, Ms. Horton.
Thanks very much. I think ASEAN is really critical. And the reason is that when you're looking at how trade patterns are evolving, a lot of countries are adding additional manufacturing capacity in ASEAN. A lot of companies have a China plus one strategy. And ASEAN is benefiting from that. When you look at RCEP, which is the largest trade system in the world now, we don't talk about it much in Canada, and China is involved in that. But it really, the linchpin of it all is ASEAN. And in terms of future growth, given their demographics, they are going to be the future, and there are a lot of exciting things happening there, and we're negotiating with ASEAN, and ASEAN is kind of the key to the Indo-Pacific strategy in terms of how we're going to be building up capacity there. So I would say that ASEAN And if we're going to be looking at ways of diversifying our interests beyond in the Southeast Asian part of the world, obviously ASEAN is the critical partner for that.
Because debate is healthy, I'm going to add a different perspective to ASEAN, but more of a security and not an economic perspective. So ASEAN is only as good as its weakest partner from a security perspective, and you have some pretty heavily compromised members of ASEAN. Publicly, I mean, Cambodia has basically helped China set up a base there. So you can, and I've had, French diplomats describe it to me as, the ASEAN fog. You kind of go there and you don't quite know what's going on and you can't really see a future or path forward. But that doesn't mean not to go. It just means if we have limited resources, maybe not to think that some grand strategy is going to come out of spending a lot of time sitting around ASEAN. I would argue the same thing with the Pacific Island Forum. That's why, the Chinese penetration and infiltration and influence operations are so advanced across the region that it really, I personally think, makes sense to do this as well as everything else. Make sure you're doing a ground-up assessment, talking to people, listening to people on the ground, and making sure that you know what's actually going on. Because those bureaucrats that end up getting sent to ASEAN or end up getting sent to the PIF are not necessarily representative either of their national governments or of the internal politics and dynamics that are shaping the realities of those countries.
Thank you very much. And I'm not sure if Mrs. Fitzgerald, you would like to weigh in on the comments.
I'll just add one further point, if I may. It's probably a middle ground between the two previous speakers. I've made my views clear on what I think is the impotent nature of the rules-based multilateralism model. Having said that, what ASEAN brings that's dissimilar to most regional and multilateral organizations is this very heavy weight placed on science, innovation, and education, higher education. And I think this is one of the reasons which drove the UK to have affiliate status of ASEAN as one of their biggest national security priorities and in the region. And so I think access on that level is important, and it's important for standards, a discussion on standards, whether it's an international dialogue on AI standards, data governance standards, et cetera. So I think access to those conversations is very important.
You have time for a very brief question, Ms. Lalonde, if you wish.
Actually, what I would like is probably hear from each of our witnesses to tell us, how could we summarize this conversation from your perspective, please?
Perhaps we'll permit some time at the very, very end for that, because you are out of time. And with that, we'll go now to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Alors, mesdames, certaines...
Well, some of you have, in fact, shaken up our sense of certainty around a number of issues by making what strikes me as counterintuitive arguments. When you say that what Indo-Pacific strategy should be focused on certain aspects, I imagine that they're claiming all of the land in the Arctic, the sovereignty of certain countries in the Arctic region is set in stone. So no Asia-Pacific countries can make any claims or stake any territory there. But I understand it goes far beyond that. And I'm going to throw a spanner in the works here. But would you say that given that our main ally, the biggest military and economic power in the world, doesn't recognize Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic, and the fact that Canada is not able to defend the Arctic in and of itself is a stumbling block that we need to come to grips with first? Ms. Horton first, and then perhaps Ms. Fitzgerald.
Thank you very much for this excellent question. I think Canada and the U.S. have kind of agreed to disagree on some of the sovereignty issues. We seem to be able to collaborate and cooperate without actually having agreed on the actual territorial boundaries. The U.S. is not a signatory to UNCLOS, I understand. So, however, I would like to reiterate what I said earlier in terms of the U.S. is critical, obviously, to the protection of the Arctic. We recognize the importance of NORAD. We are finally getting around to doing more to support NORAD, but we really need to step up in terms of our collaboration, not only with the U.S., but with other partners that I mentioned, because otherwise, even though other countries are not going to be claiming land, they have potential to help in the development in the Arctic. But we also have to counter, don't forget, Russia is also significantly interested in the Arctic for obvious reasons, and China. So it's the rest of us that will have to ensure that the Arctic is protected and developed as necessary.
We'll have time for a very brief answer from Ms. Pascal, if she has one for us.
Thank you, merci. Alors, c'est une question de loi.
Well, it's a question of law, but also enforcement.
Whatever law you want, but if you can't enforce it, it's irrelevant. And as mentioned, China is going after lawfare and trying to undermine international rules and regimes, which is what we saw in Scarborough Shoal. So we can't rely on just having a law to be able to protect sovereignty. We need to be able to enforce it. And in the Arctic, the U.S. icebreaker fleet is heavily degraded. As you mentioned, le Canada n'a vraiment pas qu'est-ce qu'il faut pour se défendre.
Canada doesn't want to have what it needs to defend itself, but Russia, in concert with China, is far more powerful, and they're going to leverage that power if it is to their advantage.
Thank you very much. Ms. McPherson, now to you for 2 minutes, 30 seconds.
Thank you very much, and I'll give some time to Ms. Fitzgerald. You talked a bit about I was interested when you were talking about how the Indo-Pacific strategy, our feminist international assistance policy, that these are cogs that need to be part of a bigger foreign policy piece. And I've long argued that our privileging of trade relationships to the exclusion of our diplomatic and our development relationships makes those trade relationships actually more difficult for us to maintain. The Indo-Pacific strategy does have some things in it with regards to development, with regards to investment in FinDev. I'm just wondering if it hits the mark and where, if it doesn't, where we need to strengthen that foreign policy piece that you were just talking about.
It's a great question. I think good strategies have clear strategic objectives that are achievable as opposed to a laundry list of aspirational things. And the Indo-Pacific strategy goes some way in comparison to others to narrow and drill down a little bit more. I think the instruments, there's a lot of uncertainty about the instruments that become enablers for execution of the strategy. And this is why I made the point that I felt national capacity building to promote our capability to navigate these new threat vectors in a data-driven and digitalized environment is fundamental to implement some of those goals in the Indo-Pacific strategy. Defense, it was recently published in Ottawa by the former Chief of Defense himself that the Canadian Armed Forces does not have the capacity to respond to the threats that the country is up against at the moment. So the outcome of the defense review is, again, very, very important to know how we're going to execute the defense and security aspects of the Indo-Pacific strategy. It is a synthesis document which is very powerful in bringing economic, social, and security levers together. But I think the tools of execution, i.e. higher education, military and defense projection, and trade priorities, just need to be fine-tuned a little bit more.
Well, and like I said, I would argue too that the idea of having development and diplomacy be part of that is key as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. Now we have 2 more 5 minutes and 2.5. So that'll wrap up this panel. We'll begin with Mr. Chong.
Yeah, I got a question about our ports. Canada's largest port is the Port of Vancouver, the flagship port, so to speak, of our global trade. It's also an Indo-Pacific port. Last year, the World Bank and S&P Global Market Intelligence ranked the Port of Vancouver 347 out of 348 global ports for efficiency, and dead last amongst all major ports of its size. So one of the pillars in the Indo-Pacific strategy is to expand Canada's trade in the Indo-Pacific region. How on earth are we supposed to do that if we have ports like Vancouver that are ranked 347th out of 348 global ports?
Could I just say that I agree with you entirely, but I would also go far as to say the ports have to be interoperable as well. And so if they're not technologized and data-driven, et cetera, they're not interoperable. And this also affects our relationship with our biggest ally.
Yeah. You know, I just have to say, you know, the Dutch ambassador came to me a number of years ago frustrated because there had been an agreement signed between the Port of Rotterdam, one of the world's leading cargo container ports, one of the gateways to Northern Europe, and the Port of Vancouver. And the Dutch management at the Port of Rotterdam had been trying to fulfill this bilateral agreement and try to connect with the Port of Vancouver, and had been so unsuccessful in trying to connect with anyone at the Port of Vancouver under this bilat that they reached out to the Dutch government to say, hey, could you try to rattle some chains up there and see if we can actually get a meeting? And she reached out to a number of people, myself included. I don't know whatever came of that, but I just thought when I read that S&P Global ranking this year, it's no surprise that we have a port that's ranked so poorly. The Port of Rotterdam actually would have a lot to offer the Port of Vancouver in terms of best practices and efficiencies and the like. It operates in a very complex, difficult environment. It's a top 10 or 15 port globally in terms of volume. And so I shake my head with the challenges that we're facing, Mr. Chair, as we try to roll out a pillar, as the government tries to roll out a pillar of the Indo-Pacific strategy. We have ports like that are ranked almost dead last in global rankings.
If I may, sir, I highly recommend going over the Cullen Commission testimony. The Port of Vancouver is known to be heavily compromised. It's considered a security risk even to the Americans by virtue of what goes through there. And it benefits malign actors for it to be a non-functioning port for clean transactions. So I would, Kelvin.
I've read the report and I was shocked by, the evidence of money laundering through the port, illegal drug trade. To hear that our national crime intelligence part of the government of Canada last year estimated that $133 billion annually is being laundered through the Canadian economy, the equivalent of almost 6% of our GDP. Just makes me wonder, like, how did we get to this point where 6% of our GDP is laundered through the economy? Much of it international money laundering, much of it coming through ports like Vancouver. And I'm just, in some ways the problem almost seems overwhelming, Mr. Chair, in how we're going to deal with it. I had a second quick question. The government just recently announced a new security policy on research. They issued two lists, a list of sensitive technology research areas and a list of named research organizations, many of them in the People's Republic of China. I'm wondering if the witnesses would comment on, if this is a good approach or if there are gaps in that approach that was recently announced.
I'll let my colleagues lead. I've led the last couple ones.
Professor Horton, you haven't had a chance in the last one. Do you want to go ahead?
I think that there are many different ways to approach this problem. I don't know whether any of them are going to have the necessary effect or if we're actually too late on some of them. What I'm concerned about is that if China is still the second largest economy in the world, and it has very impressive research capabilities. And so I'm hoping that we can find a way to steer our researchers in the right direction and protect ourselves at the same time.
All right. With that, the chair would add, by the way, that as a British Columbian, a former member of the Transport Committee, acutely aware of the issues at the Port of Vancouver, there have been some major leadership changes there within the last year. It would be worth our while in the fullness of time to bring in some of those leaders and see what they recognize and what they're prepared to do. That's a good point. Mr. Oliphant, it's over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start with Ms. Horton. Thank you for your testimony today. Thank all the witnesses for their work and helping us today. You've written talking about Canada will have to leverage its limited impact by maximizing complementarity with its partners. Looking at the Indo-Pacific strategy, obviously we can't do everything. We do have to focus, and there is some focusing in it. Earlier tonight in the first panel, one of our witnesses suggested we should not be engaging as much, or I wasn't even sure exactly what he was talking about, with Vietnam, because it didn't meet the standards of Canadian engagement. Rather, we would focus on other countries which were more vibrant democracies. I just wanted your take on that and whether that is the correct way to strategize or whether there are more pragmatic ways to do it.
Well, I'm actually speaking at an event in a couple of weeks in Toronto because Minister Mary Ng is taking a delegation to Vietnam. So I think in terms of when you look at trading and investment patterns, and having worked in Vietnam, yes, it's a communist country, but in terms of what were the opportunities for Canada there are real. And I think it's going to be difficult to find, there's no such thing as a perfect democracy. And, you know, people cite Singapore. Singapore is not a perfect democracy by any stretch of the imagination. So whether, I think we have to be careful who we are dealing with, but on the other hand, we always have to recognize what the opportunities are. And I think Vietnam signed on to the CPTPP. They made a lot of changes in order to do so. And I think that much more so than China, Vietnam is more open and more interested in working with countries like Canada, and they are an amazing people with a great entrepreneurial spirit, and I think that we should be there. And because we have a Vietnamese diaspora, I think that we have an advantage as opposed to other countries. So I think we should take advantage of that too.
Thank you. I wanted to get a little bit of a course correction there, and you did that, which is exactly what I think we need to be sensitive. I could get into a long story, which I won't get into, but it's interesting. Anyway, to another time. On that, generally then to the other witnesses, and it falls a little bit on Ms. Lalonde's comment about what you would like to summarize in here, and we will get a couple of summary times, but if there's something around how to strategically maximize Canada's gifts and resources in the Indo-Pacific region, what do you think are the top 2 or 3 priorities?
I think we have something. Oh, okay, I think that's gone now. Do you want to choose the person that you'd like to respond first?
Let's start with Dr. Fitzgerald, and let us hear a couple of things you want us about how we would strategize and be specific, narrowing our focus because we can't do everything all the time.
Right. Okay. I think there's scope for a secondary document that focuses on execution. And prioritizes with a temporal element perhaps included as to what's going to happen in the short to medium term and what's going to then set things up for the medium to longer term aspirations. I think that there's tremendous potential in science diplomacy, and the issue of the research framework was raised for Canada. Instead of just pinpointing institutions, I think that we could put a strategic framework around things like that and do a lot of grassroots upward using our very good relationships between academic to academic organizations, civil society to civil society organizations. And lastly, especially as a professor of national security, I would say that defense and security diplomacy is key. And I've studied carefully the trends of Canada in the past and the influence that we had that, in my view, and having worked with the British government for many years as a security advisor, went beyond the impact that the British government had during those years when we kept military and security cooperation high.
At your time, yes. We will have now 2.5 minutes from Mr. Bergeron and 2.5 minutes from Ms. McPherson, and then I'd like to give the panelists here that have been very, very great with their time, maybe a minute each to give us their final thoughts. All right, so to you, Mr. Bergeron, for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Ms. Fitzgerald, the article. You didn't have an opportunity to respond to my question. Would you like to take that opportunity now?
Thank you very much. If I remember correctly, it was about priorities in the Arctic, and I think, yes. So my sense is based on the military-industrial bases in the Far East and what we're seeing in terms of ice-breaking equipment and what I anticipate will come to countries like China through difficult negotiations with Europe over the extension of the Middle Corridor. We will see China at our doorstep trying to negotiate on access to the Arctic very quickly. Now, Canada, I think, is in a very strong position to lead on ocean governance. And if we had an ocean governance framework, at the very least, at best, an Arctic strategy, and trickling down from that, an ocean governance framework, it would not only put us in a very ready position for those probably hard negotiations, it would give us influence within the Arctic Circle to get wider buy-in into that governance framework. And I think that's where Canada can make a real difference. The relationship with NORAD, I think, is a very strong and underestimated relationship. Even, let's put the sovereignty issues aside. I think if we can use technology, IP around it, to be able to monitor every square mile of our Arctic region, I think that can provide a lot of future economic benefits to Canada, especially having got wider agreement on an ocean governance framework.
Est-ce qu'il me reste du temps, Monsieur le Président?
Any time left, Mr. Chair?
Thank you. We've got. We'll go to. We'll go to Ms. McPherson now.
The 2.5 minutes go very, very fast. And I actually had a question similar to the chairs. We're 1 year in to having the Indo-Pacific strategy. I'd like to hear from all of the witnesses on how well it's working, how well it's achieving the goals that it is articulated. Maybe I'll start with you, Ms. Fitzgerald.
Well, I think as a professor of defense and security and national security, we're waiting to see the defense policy roll out, engagement to happen in a significant manner on that front. I would like to see good organizations like the Asia Pacific Foundation, which has been given the mandate and the means to be a facilitator for interactions between the two regions, launch their good wares and facilitate interactions between the Canadian leading academic institutions and our counterparts in the region. I think that is an easy win, a quick win, and we've got a great organization there to do it.
Ms. Horton?
I would second Professor Fitzgerald's confidence in the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. I think it's too early to tell. I mean, there's been a lot of heightened engagement, but really judging from previous experience, the proof will be in the pudding. And we don't know yet how long this is going to last and whether it will last into future administrations. And we tend to lose interest. So let's hope that this committee can help and keep pushing it forward.
And Ms. Pascal?
Yeah, viewed from the region, what happened with India has been a real big setback for Canada. You can't underestimate the influence of India across multilateral fora, and regardless of the incident, this has however nice the strategy is, what happened with India has been a real setback. And I would also say that there's a definite lack of feeling of urgency on the part of Canada, and it could be because, like Ottawa is nowhere near the Pacific, but when you're out in the Pacific, and I think my co-panelists also spend time out in the Pacific, you can feel something's coming. And there's no, there's nothing in there that is preparing us for example, a Taiwan contingency, which you hope doesn't happen, but you at least have to have a plan.
Thank you.
All right. So to wrap up then, a minute each. Your thoughts, pearl of wisdom that you'd like to leave us with, things we should be thinking about. It's your choice, but we'll start with you, Ms. Pascal, and then move to Ms. Horton, and then to Ms. Fitzgerald.
Bon, mais la première chose, c'est qu'il faut absolument.
First things first, I have to work on my French a bit. I'm getting rusty, but aside from that, we need to focus on corruption. Short of doing that, it's going to be difficult delivering in every other domain. Now, if we work on corruption, it'll change Canada's the perception of Canada in the region. There are a whole host of countries and organizations that want to work on that issue, but they lack the resources to do so. I don't know why. Australia isn't working on it whatsoever. Don't know why. But that said, if there is one single thing that everything focuses on is corruption. Corruption at the hands of the Chinese. This changes the geopolitical checkerboard.
Thank you. Ms. Horton, now to you.
Thank you very much. I would say Canada is a services economy. We focus way too much on goods, and we have such expertise. We have amazing financial services firms, life insurance, et cetera, who are very active in Asia. And my studies on Canadians in Asia in terms of companies, software, analytics, we've got a lot of great tech companies that are very active there. Let's support them. Let's continue to work. And then also North Pacific, Japan and Korea, that will give us the additional balance and also power, leverage in Asia. We can't do it alone.
And Ms. Fitzgerald, to you.
Thank you very much. I'll just repeat, we do better when we know better. And if we are going to de-risk and decouple, which is necessary to implement a strategy like our Indo-Pacific region, we need to focus at home as well as abroad. And at home, a national capacity building effort to operate in an intangibles market is absolutely fundamental. And 92% of the S&P 500 at the moment accounts for intangibles. That's how much we're in that marketplace. Lastly, good strategies have specific objectives because you can't manage what you cannot measure. And good strategies also build and bolster existing strengths. Two of Canada's existing strengths include the higher education system and also our military and defense and science diplomacy capacity. And I would encourage the committee to look at continuing to bolster these strengths. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank our panelists. It's been a fascinating session. We will adjourn for just a moment to give the panelists a chance to make their way, and then we'll go into our business session right after that. All right? So just a moment. So I think that the first order of business for this section of our meeting will be the work plan. We have just finished meeting 3, and we could have as many as 7 total meetings. And the material that was distributed over the last day or so has a lot of information on what could possibly comprise those meetings. We know that on the 12th of February, a week from now, we'll have the ambassador of Japan and the Indo-Pacific Enterprise groups, et cetera, et cetera. This is just really a temperature check to make sure that in the meetings to come, we have the potential to answer the questions that we need answered in order to develop a worthwhile and a useful report. Any comments on the work plan? Are we going to be good for 7 meetings total?
Yep. It was an excellent panel today.
It was very excellent. Absolutely. Any further thoughts on that one? Good. Okay. Ms. McPherson, I think you wanted to talk potentially about travel. Did you have something there? I caught your question a little earlier, okay? And I think so did Mr. Bergeron, as I recall.
I just like to entertain Mr. Bergeron, mostly is why I'm here. Well, I know the deadline is coming up. I don't know if there's any potential for that, perhaps. Is there? We're in camera.
We're not in public.
No, we are in public session.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we are in public session.
Well, then I will stop looking accusingly at certain members of our committee. I think it would be fantastic.
Point of order.
Yes.
Is our business meeting normally in public? I thought business meetings we always did in camera.
We do in camera when we're talking about reviewing a study, draft studies, etc. This is just basically lining up what's coming up next.
I would ask that in the future our business meetings are in camera. That's been the tradition of our committees everywhere, because we get into discussions like that. I just think it's a dangerous precedent. I think business meetings should be in camera, and it allows us to have discussions like this.
Since this one is not, if I could just reiterate, I think that it would be useful for the committee to travel. I think there's value in parliamentary diplomacy. Obviously, that was made clear by our panelists this evening. It is an important role that parliamentarians play and can play in the region, and particularly as we are continuing to try to develop more relationships in that area. I think it would be very useful, and I would like us to be able to put a proposal forward if that seemed at all worth the clerk and analysts' efforts at this time.
All right. Yes, Mr. Oliphant.
Since we are not in camera, I think it would be handy for us to go around the table and circle whether parties are interested in preparing travel and whether or not their party whips would be engaged in allowing us as an international committee to travel. And I would say that yes, on our side of the table, the Liberal Party would be very pleased to try to work up a travel plan, because we think it's essential for members of Parliament to travel, and it's even more essential for committees like this to travel. Thank you.
All right, and we'll go back and we'll start from that end of that side of the table toward this end. Ms. McPherson.
I think I've made it very clear. I think this is a key role for this committee. I think that parliamentary diplomacy is a key thing that we can offer, and I think that the New Democrats would be very supportive of travel to the region.
Well, Mr. Bergeron, I mean, you joined a lot of us in Taiwan, and there certainly was significant benefit from that. Would the bloc be in agreement with travel for this committee?
Absolument. Je crois que la diplomatie.
Absolutely. I do firmly believe that parliamentary democracy is a tool that the government should avail itself of and benefit from, with a view to exercising some level, wielding some influence abroad. Now, that would require a lot of contact with stakeholders far beyond our borders. Now, in our committee, just like at the Foreign Affairs Committee, I think that it is really crucial that parliamentarians take part in travel. Now, 2 things, Mr. Chair, if I may. which have something to do with what I said earlier. Do we have any updates about our US counterparts and them potentially visiting Ottawa in the future? And secondly, is there any interest in reaching out to the department on the report on Taiwan?
On the first one, we have not had further engagement with our colleagues in Washington. I was going to suggest that perhaps the lack of connectivity between the American Indo-Pacific Plan and the Canadian Indo-Pacific Plan might suggest that in the course of this study we invite the chair of that committee as a witness here, that we can talk about the American plan and opportunities to integrate. That was something that certainly came up in the discussions we had in Washington, and so I think that would be worthwhile. I would detect from around the room, though, that there would be interest in an invitation to the special committee in the States to come up here and have a more formal session than the rather casual meeting that we had in Washington. I don't know. I'll look around the room to see if there's a general agreement on that one. Mr. Oliphant?
General agreement. I wanted to stick to travel at this point just because I'd like to get out of the meeting. But yes, generally, I think we've already discussed that, and I thought we all thought it was a good idea.
Okay, very good. Mr. Kimmich? Oh, sorry.
The report on Taiwan?
Report on this would be to bring back officials to see where we're at with our recommendations. Is that what you had in mind?
Okay, ça va.
Okay.
I'll come back.
Okay, good. Mr. Kimmich.
So without speaking on behalf of my whip, because I've done that before as caucus chair, and that worked out well for me, I guess. First of all, the distances we're talking about to travel to Asia are quite far. And so travel would have to be done, I think, during non-sitting weeks at minimum. And I think it really should only be done in July and August. That way we are not at risk of missing any sitting days of the House. I think that's the first part. These are long distances as well that we're talking about. And so cost, accommodation, flights, and everything else, I think that would be a serious consideration as well for any type of travel that this committee would consider going forward.
One would think, too, that because of the amount of territory involved, in the Indo-Pacific region, that we might wish to prioritize perhaps some key places that we could visit, but that's just my thought and comment.
Or split.
Pardon me, I'm sorry, Mr. Bergeron?
L'autre proposition que je pourrais faire, ce serait...
What we could do, and I had this experience at the Foreign Affairs Committee in a previous life as a federal MP, that would be to divide the committee in two so that we could divide and conquer in a sense and cover more territory. That's what we did, for example, when we studied the ties between Canada and the Muslim Arab world. Part of the committee, half of the committee went to Northern Africa and the Middle East, and the other part went to the Far East, and that enabled us to maximize our efficiency.
I'm wondering then, with deadlines coming up to make the pitch for committee travel, if all of us could check with our whips just to get a sense of the comfort in that. Is that an agreeable thing to ask at this point? Okay.
Agreed.
Very good. All right. So we have the calendar. We have, I think, a general agreement that we'll have 7 meetings. We've heard, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance will be with us between 8:30 and 9:30 on the 26th of the month. And we can't, of course, pass over the fact that we're going to be missing quite a few Mondays because of the constituency weeks that have stacked themselves up in the spring session. So, is there anything else that we needed to cover, Mr. Bergeron?
Je reviens sur la question de Taïwan.
I'd like to come back to the issue of Taiwan, if I may. It strikes me that at one of our first meetings this year, or rather in the fall, we discussed the fact that we were, in fact, caught short in the sense that we were lacking a detailed response on the part of the Department on Foreign Affairs on a number of relevant and important recommendations we made concerning Taiwan. For example, one response was, we simply take note of your recommendations. Now, has there been anything further? Has anything occurred within the department in terms of their thinking process on this? I think that a number of members of this committee are interested in coming back to and focusing our attention on the Taiwan report. The question is, how would we approach that, and how would we actually make that happen at the end of the day?
I could offer experience we've had in another committee where a motion comes forward to bring back officials to review the reaction and actions following a report. Mr. Oliphant, do you have something to offer?
I just think technically a report is done. Government has made a response, and Parliament has the opportunity through a concurrence debate. Our House Leader wouldn't want us to say that, but the opposition frequently raises concurrence motions. They do it regularly. It stops government business on a very regular basis. Sometimes they are absolutely absurd because we all know it. But this one, if someone isn't happy with a government response, we can certainly have a concurrence debate. I don't know the timing on that and whether it's passed or not, but that is built into our standing orders to do a concurrence debate on a report if people are interested in the report from the government, the response from the government.
I would note that we actually did have, I don't know if it was a motion, Madam Clerk, or not, but there was an agreement that we would have a meeting on Taiwan after we had concluded this study. So, in fact, yes, and to re-invite Harry Zhang, the Trade Commissioner, to come and talk to us. Of course, they've had an election since then, and a few other things that we could, serve to catch up on. I don't know that we talked about it. We haven't had a motion. Don't know if we need one, but we have certainly our hands full on this study. And as we get to the conclusion of this study, we can revisit, the desirability of having a follow-up session on Taiwan. Does that sound like a plan?
Oui.
Very good. All right.
Agreed as well. I just don't think it needs to be on the report. I think an update on Taiwan is always good.
All right. Anything else before we wrap? Well, the energy level in the room, despite the hour, has been great. It's been a great session. I want to thank our clerk, our analysts, our translators, staff, both the parliamentary and the office staff. And with that, we will adjourn.